future. And also as a reminder, the HiboCon Robot Battle Royale just began at Hardware Hacking Village. And then after this talk, we have lunch. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Thank you guys for being here. I know how much HiboCon is entertaining, so I appreciate you guys coming out. So this talk, how many people here have participated, organized, or been involved in any way with a competition? Just to get the general idea. Okay, so the people here, you obviously are familiar with how competitions are built. And the goal for this talk is to give you a little bit of insight into some of the organizational issues and challenges that we have run into as taking over Western Regional Cyber Defense Competition, and how we've seen it applied in other competitions and how we applied those challenges and solutions to our own competition. So getting started here, I am Wasabi, Spicy Wasabi on Twitter, and right next to me is bluescreenofwin. Together we lead Black Team for the Western Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition, which means we build the competition. And a little brief bio if you want to read it. But for the most part, we went to school competing, we graduated, and now we continue to give back to the community as an effort to help keep people moving forward and learning new things. So maybe the best way to start is to understand what happened at the beginning of last year. We, at least myself, had previously organized and helped on Black Team with Western Regional Competition. However, something changed. Suddenly we were no longer getting communications from other organizers. Everything seemed to just halt. And as a competition, you know their deadlines. And suddenly things that we were supposed to be hitting on target were just disappearing in front of us. So one of the biggest challenges was, how do we deal with this? And it ended up being more than just losing communication. We lost access to our hardware, we lost access to our resources, and that gave us an opportunity to completely start over. For better or worse, we had to learn how a competition is built from the ground up and what it takes to actually run that competition. And I will say it's more than just the challenges. That was one of the biggest things we learned, was that the challenges are a small part. Everyone wants to participate and do challenges for a CTF, for CCDC, for any sort of competition. The challenges are what everyone thinks of when they want to volunteer. The reality is, unfortunately, there's a lot of logistical planning. There's a lot of things that have to go on with putting everything together, verifying it works. If you think about a competition organizing event, or organizing a competition as an event, it becomes more like a job, and people don't like hearing that. But the reality is, it is very much like a job where you have to have people validating, doing documentation, doing planning, doing meetings. It's a lot of work, but because of those things, if you execute them well, and it doesn't have to take a lot of time, if you execute those repeatedly, what happens is it becomes easier to manage when the day comes and you have to put on the event. So, time to take it on. How did we take over building a competition? Well, volunteers. We did an all-call. We said, hey, anyone who wants to compete, come. We will help you. We will let you join. And I didn't want to call it a tryout because, you know, everyone is mostly out of the universities or anything that would be where a tryout would take place. But we said, come out, help out, and see if you have the time and bandwidth to participate. So I've spoken at conferences, we've gone to conferences for many years, and that allowed us to get insights on how things were doing. Reverse Shell Corp has put on CTFs many years, and some of those things that they put on, we pulled in with automation and how they isolate servers and services. So we took everything we learned and we built it into a new event. And as I was saying before, it's easy to build challenges. Everyone wants to build that terrible VM in the case of CCDC, the one that it barely works. You boot it up and it switches between Russian, Korean, and Chinese, and then it does something else, and then it reboots and deletes all the partitions. That's fun. It's funny. But the problem is that competitions change, and the teams now demand more out of a competition than just having something that self-destructs on them. And so we had to develop very quickly new things. So we had to put limits on what could be destroyed. We had to put input into what could be built. Everything became a list of things that were checkboxes for the basic parts. Does the system boot? Is it hosting a web server? If the web server is being hosted, what is it running? And we went through this list, and once we got those general ideas, that literally turned into what we gave the teams. It made it easier for us, and it also scaled better because when we checked out what that web server that deleted itself was doing, it was supposed to be hosting, a blog. When it no longer is hosting the blog, we know that it's not working. So we were able to easily correct and fix those issues. So the problem, though, again, is that teams and competitors start demanding more and more out of a competition. If you have something fun the first year, they expect it to be as fun, if not more fun, the next year. That doesn't go into consideration what it takes to actually put it on. They just expect it. It's not a problem, but it's something that you have to be aware of. Organizing takes quite a bit of time, and if you're not prepared for what it takes to organize, it's easy to get very, very discouraged because the competitors will say, this was terrible, I never want to compete in this again. And even when things go completely right, what will happen is competitors will again say, this was terrible, I don't want to do this. And you ask them why, and the reality is they just say, I didn't like it. I hated this system, I couldn't figure out how to change the password, for example. Or I tried to break into it and I knew it was vulnerable to MS-08 because it was Windows XP. But the reality is, if we didn't give them enough information, they get frustrated. So we had to learn that teams and competitors especially need a lot of input from what is being built. If you don't give it to them, they will find their own ways to solve what they think is the problem. And that causes its own problems because they may have found a problem that did not exist. If you're trying to patch a server or you're trying to break into a server and they, for example, think it's Windows XP, but it's actually Windows Server, 2016, MS-08 obviously wouldn't work. The vulnerabilities and the strategies change. And they may be finding a solution that they thought was right, get frustrated that they couldn't do it, and then reality is it never worked. So the challenge is pleasing, as we started calling it, the customers. And you can throw more resources at it, but the problem is resources cost a lot of money. We found, and we'll get into this a little more, we want to do everything in AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. And the reality is it doesn't necessarily work that well when you have everything in the cloud because building stuff takes time, whether it's a CTF or any type of competition. If you're building the challenge, you're having to spin it up, tear it down, test, verify, and it's this process that takes time. Now, if you're charging in a cloud, it takes, several days. That's several days of money that you don't have now. Oh, okay. Come back. There we go. I guess I'll have to just keep moving the mouse. But costs are important, and the thing that really came home to us was that if we get a cheap server to build stuff off of and dev off of, it makes it easier in the end where you want to put it, because then it no longer matters how you build it or anything like that. So, and then the thing that I want to drive home to everyone who is considering taking on a competition and leading organizing it is people are the most unreliable component of a competition. Servers will work, desktops will work, virtual machines will work, everything will work. The problem is getting people to build those things. And you may say, hey, automation's great, I can automate and do what 5 people used to do with 1 person. The reality, though, is you still need that 1 person. And people will, not intentionally so, but accidentally have very poor time management. And it's not something that you can fix. You can't tell someone who's volunteering their time, you need to dedicate this time, you need to spend the time doing this documentation, you need to spend the time building this so we know how to rebuild it. You need to make sure it works. The reality is everyone is a volunteer. And the only thing I can say to people who are volunteering is that when you don't complete your tasks, it falls onto someone else. But as an organizer, you have to be aware of that and make sure you have plans so that when you get to crunch time, there's someone else already fixing that system or that challenge that someone didn't build. So that's the point that I found taking over leading, but it changes depending on who you are in the org. All right, So I think this should have been at the beginning. General thing is that competitions are, I kind of want an input here on what people thought a competition was, because there's different scope. If you're at LayerOne, the competitions are for fun. They're for testing your skills and seeing if you have the knowledge. For college competitors, what it is to get out and get your name known so you can get a job. For companies, a competition becomes testing whether your employees have skill or who you want to hire. So the scope is always different. Obviously, it comes down to skills, but if you don't know that scope, you may design a competition that doesn't really focus on what people actually are needing or want. So let's fall into what is Western Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. A lot of words. The acronym is WRCCDC. Can't do that. I think this will be a little easier. So it started in 2008, and the main goal of the competition was a prototype originally, but has evolved into testing people's skills at defending and managing systems. And while we're at a security conference, most people are thinking, hey, this is not really focused on, the red teaming, the attacking, the challenge, the exploit development. The reality, though, is that people have to know these, the competitors have to know these things very well, because they're going up against some of the best red teamers in the areas, the regions. And of course, the final goal is to simulate a business. As all these students are going eventually into jobs, being able to see how a corporate environment looks loosely gives them a step ahead than their peers. So you may be asking, why would I build a competition like that? Well, it's very special to us. We've competed in it. I myself competed for 4 years, and it's unique in the sense that it challenges defense and strategy compared to where a CTF may be testing the challenges. The strategy comes into play. Everything you know up to the competition is all you're going to know. When you step into that room and you compete, you're not going to learn anything else. If you found something you don't understand, you are not going to learn it until the competition's over. And in the CTF, you can spend time developing that new skill, that new knowledge. But in CDC, it's everything you know up to that competition is what you will know. And it's an interesting to see how teams strategize that solution. And on the bottom over here is a simple network from a couple of years ago. But that's where we begin. So when we took over, when we started developing this stuff, officially we weren't actually running anything. We just said, let's try to do what we can to make this event better. And we had to start from scratch. So we chose we looked at different cloud providers. We started looking at different solutions to get hosting up, because we want to have give teams the ability to test their skills before the actual competition. We viewed the competitors as customers, and our view was if we please the customers, they will want to come back and actually compete. And our goal for them competing was that if they return, we will still have a competition to put together. And it was very scary for us, because we did not know if the event would actually go on. So we started doing tests, we started doing trainings, and to our surprise, the teams really were receptive to this. So as I was saying, we had nothing behind us. So how do we keep our job, and how do we continue to please the customers that we found? Well, one of the biggest things was creativity. We wanted to build something very creative and new and unique instead of what people were getting frustrated with. And we saw that teams were getting frustrated because the shift from the competition was, instead of defending and cybersecurity, it became more focused on business. So we started shifting it back to cybersecurity. We started actively talking with the different groups, red teams, blue teams, and all the different people who help organize the competition. And we started getting communication back again. And we realized the question for us was, how do you make an information security competition fun and informative? And so that's where we begin. So we went through and we rebuilt the rules. We defined what actually was supposed to happen, what people were supposed to do, what we expected of you, what did the competition expect of us, and most of all, what did the teams want from us. We started asking, and one of the things that comes home is, since we're a regional, we're not the national competition, what teams want the most of is how to get a leg up in the national competition. How do they understand, how do they learn the skills that they need to be able to survive the national competition? Because it's much different and very hard. So we started focusing on getting information from competitors who had gone to nationals, and more recently than us. So we got information, we started building out documentation and stuff. And I know this sounds all terribly boring, but the reality is if you build a competition, when you, for example, the CTF outside, there is documentation, there is instructions on how to connect, there are instructions, there are hints, there is little bits of information that you probably aren't even aware of that all have to be written, and someone has to do that. And for us, we had to start over again to build that information. And of course, because this all sounds very serious and boring and unfun, I want to assure you that it is very fun for us. We enjoy being silly and making all these terrible images and building challenges because that's what we enjoy. So this picture here is where we were serenading the teams with every single meme video that we could find, 10 hours edition. And of course it's annoying, but that's the type of silly stuff that we'll randomly do. And we'll put little Easter eggs in the competitions. And the goal for all of this is that we have fun, hoping the teams will also have fun, and not putting too much burden on anyone. If the volunteers are not enjoying it, then we shouldn't even have a competition because it's not supposed to be a job. It's supposed to be something that people enjoy. So one thing we also realized was competitions, especially large ones like CCDC, kind of stagnate. And not in a bad way, but they don't embrace the new technologies that exist. If I were to tell you, we don't have a cloud, there's nothing hosted in AWS or anything like that, you'd be like, that doesn't make sense because companies do that all the time. So we've started embracing those new changes, and we've started building things where teams have to actually understand the new skills. And for us, working our day jobs, that's easy. But for teams who have never experienced any of these things before, that's a challenge. So while we're introducing those new techniques, we have to be mindful that the teams, in fact, don't actually know how to set up these things or manage them. So we have to give them hints and help them out. So learning became the goal for the competition this year. And everything we built had the strategy behind what does it teach someone who's competing in this competition. And so with that goal, we set out to build actually Jurassic Park. Unfortunately, we couldn't use the name, so we called it Triassic Land. And we built everything. We built ICS systems that were completely custom. We built them so they had to be scanned, analyzed. Teams had to figure out how to isolate them. And there were different ways they could do that. We didn't set it in fixed in stone that one way worked above all. We said, if you can find a way to fix it, we will accept that because you will no longer be accessible to Red Team. So we had a lot of different things that we thought of and built a fake company. And we started back last year around now and spent the year building a full complete company with content and documentation and layering on the different things that were going on until we had a system that was 40 plus computers and hundreds of domain users and ICS systems, different monitoring agents, and all sorts of things that you see in a normal company, but for teams competing, they'd never seen that before. So we started giving them hints and giving them documentation to prepare. And of course, no matter what you do with the competitions, there will be teams and competitors who are just simply not ready for it. This goes for any competition. I wanted to list all of them. There's CTFs, there's CCDC, CPTC, Hack the Box. There's tons of competitions. And so if you want to get involved in them, think about how you can help people with your competition. That's what I found was the most valuable for me, was if I help people, they enjoy the industry more and they will in turn share back. I've seen a lot of people go from CCDC to big jobs and then come back and start speaking at conferences because they've learned so much and they want to give back. And that's the goal for me. And of course, for those who are not familiar with CCDC, this screenshot here, they're currently failing all their services except one, and they're playing Halo on the screen. So we have what we called the Mr. Robot dilemma, and it's something that I'm sure people have thought about but maybe not really discussed. And it's that hacking looks cool on TV. Everyone loves to hack. And hacking looks like something where you type a bunch of random keystrokes and then the computer completely breaks into the Pentagon. The reality is that doesn't actually happen. Hacking isn't fun. It's not necessarily even interesting because you have policy work, you have other things that have to happen. And people get, especially students who have never experienced that, they get bored, they get frustrated because they expect their whole job, their whole time competing, their whole time working with systems to be that fun, exciting thing where you break into boxes one after the other. And the reality isn't so true. And one of the things we have found is that if it isn't easy, they don't want to do it. We've found people where they realize that to defend the system or to break into the system, if they can't click the one button, they can't go into Armitage and click Hail Mary, that it's not a good competition. It's not something that they should be doing. So what we started working on was how do we make people put in that effort to understand and become better red teamers, blue teamers, and in general system administrators. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to drive home is that TV shapes what people think of our industry, and we don't really explain to people what the reality is and how it can be fun, how it's interesting. So I think that's something that people should be aware of, is that if being a good administrator, being good at using the basic tools really will help people understand the red teaming and everything else later. So, because again, the reality is that you don't have to do all these crazy 0 days to get into a system, because most of the time it's sitting on a sticky note or it's still running Windows XP. And that's the truth, is that our industry is mostly about fixing. We hear about all these major issues, but in reality it's low-hanging fruit that we have to defend and fix or get into. So with that, we're going to start building a competition here. So one of the things is we start with competition organizers being in their own little bubbles and trying to bridge those bubbles so we can start learning how things work. How do people expect their specific roles to be? For example, if you're in red team on CCDC, you are expecting to break into the systems. You're expecting to do things with jokes and memes and have systems get crypto-lockered or any other type of vulnerability. So sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, because as a competitor, again, we think as organizers, we think it's funny, but as a competitor, it's really frustrating when your system just destroys itself before you even log in. And you don't know if it's you or not, because in the stress of the moment, it's not like a regular job where you can have time to look through. You have seconds and then it's gone. And so you feel like you've done something terribly wrong. And so our goal was to make the realistic, reasonable scenarios. So we started asking, should we do this and does it make sense, instead of could we? And a lot of this applies to CTFs, where it'll be something very obscure and very confusing. And if we're looking at something that's more for beginners and trying to get people interested in this industry, we should be asking, should we do that? Should we be building it up? Should we have the hard challenge at the end and have several easier challenges to help get people finding their way? And one of the things I found in the several CTFs I've built, I'm nowhere near the level of any of the LayerOne CTFs or anything like that. But what I have found is that when you're building a CTF, if you give people stepping stones to build on, they will follow those steps very well. Even if the complexity goes up, they can still follow those steps and understand how to get to the final challenge, the hardest one. If you tell them only that the hardest challenge exists, they may be trying different paths and not know how to go forward. And then when the competition ends, now that they followed those paths, that's something that they will look back on and learn from. So again, the goal is we want to encourage learning and people being interested and happy to be in this field, not pushing them away. So again, it's building time. We looked at several things. For our year last year, we found that using dedicated hosts was cheaper than using AWS or buying servers or anything like that, because it just worked. It worked from anywhere. And at the time, we saw their uptime reliability, and we thought, That makes sense. And another driving reason is there's no longer the home office. There's no longer server rooms as much in buildings. Most of the stuff is hosted online. Most companies are now not using a dedicated Exchange host, but instead they're using Office 365 or other solutions. So we put that into play. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Bluescreen, who will be going over the steps of what we did to build the competition this year.
Ooh, that sounds fun in there. Hi, everyone. Bluescreenofwin. I've been doing CCDC with Joe and all the other black teamers now for a couple years now. And this year was interesting because when we stepped into it, traditionally we have a few of our debriefing meetings kind of around the summer, and then we start moving forward and deciding what kind of scenario we want to do and, you know, all that fun stuff. But last year was interesting because we had a major change in leadership, which left us, you know, financially questionable and kind of left us with, well, how do we pay for our resources? How do we build these resources out? And how do we get people to help us if we can't provide them any type of a future? Well, what we decided to do was, okay, let's start with something cheap. So we decided, okay, so we got to put our resources somewhere, right? So we thought, okay, maybe let's host everything online. So we decided, okay, so, well, let's take it a step back further. Who's our target audience, right? We have students, of course, which primarily being a blue team competition, we want to make sure that no matter what we do, it's accessible by the students, and more than that, it's accessible by the people that are actually volunteering and helping build these systems out, right? Moreover than that, but historically, you know, it's ran by professionals, or we like to call ourselves professionals, right? And we want to make sure that it's something that's interesting to us and it's fun, more importantly. And sometimes, historically, CCDC gets sometimes a little bit of a bad rap, being that, you know, oh, it's just memes and they're playing stupid music and okay. But, you know, we bust our ass all year round, and, you know, we want to play one meme song, we're sorry. We try to step back from that a little bit in recent times because we get a lot of flack from blue teams, because when they step into a competition, they don't necessarily want what we want. They want to take something that they can apply to a resume. They want to be able to sit down in front of an interviewer and say, you know, I learned these things. I learned from some of the best in the industry, or, you know, some of the people that at least taught them something or instilled either some confidence or some inspiration in them, and they wanted to move forward in this field, which is really why we do it, most importantly, because that's how we got started, or at least me. Doing CCDC, you know, 4 years ago is what really got me started in information security, really, because I didn't think any of this stuff was approachable, but in fact, it really is. And there's a lot of different, you know, competitors, right? We have like small, large competitors, teams, and we have primarily schools. One thing that we're thought, like, well, we try to have these, you know, schools compete against each other, universities versus community colleges, right? So this year, one of the things that our director is thinking about doing is having maybe a separate bracket for community colleges come in. That way they can, you know, test their skills, get a little bit of a training, and then kind of open the doors to some of the smaller schools competing. That way they can get their foot in the doors in information security as well, and they can actually, you know, compete and feel as though they're, you know, not necessarily wasting their time, but, you know, they want to be able to step in and, you know, hit the ground running. So our costs over the last year were very interesting because we decided, like, okay, so AWS too expensive, Azure too expensive, maybe we can get a grant. It was too late for that, because by the time some of our leadership stepped down, people who were handling our finances, it was already August. And I don't know if anyone here is familiar with CCDC. I know I see a lot of familiar faces, but it's kind of too late. You know, we need to be applying for our grants and trying to secure our funding way in advance. So it just wasn't happening. So to Canada we went. We decided to go to OVH, hosted out of Montreal. It's like $300 a month per server, fantastic. We can host any type of hypervisor we wanted on it. Supposedly it was a 10 gig backbone. It wasn't. But it was good enough for us to get started, right? And then we decided, okay, so now we have this, we have our resources, let's move forward. What kind of scenario do we want to do? We have a huge list on Google Doc on what kind of scenarios we like to do, and we kind of kicked it around a little bit. And last year was funny because I remember at the Sheraton, actually 2 years ago, we were sitting down day 2 of CCDC, drinking at the Sheraton, thinking like, oh, what scenario do we want to do? And then Jurassic Park stuck in everyone's mind. And then Joe kind of ran with that. And then when we had our first debrief meeting in August, he's like, I have Jurassic Land, fun. We can do it. I don't think they'll mind. So like we decided, okay, so I guess we're doing dinosaurs this year, right? But more importantly, we want to make it fun. You know, we want to do something that's actually going to bring the blue teams back year over year, because there is a lot of turnover rate. because what's necessarily fun to us is maybe not necessarily fun to blue teams, unfortunately. But with that being said, it's being more fun for organizers necessarily isn't a bad thing, because it drives us to talk to sponsors, it drives us to talk to other professionals in the field and try to encourage people to volunteer, because more importantly, it's like any other competition, it's very volunteer driven. As you can see, we put a lot of effort into our content. We have Merlini Storage, making your shit disappear. We have Jeff Bridges, Bridges and Ridges, the CEO, Jeff Bridges at Jeff Bridges, Bridges and Ridges. That was a fun one. That was one of our invitationals last year. And then, of course, we have the logo for Triassic Land. But one of the fun things we did this year is trying to incorporate not necessarily volunteers, but people interested in competing. Was that, unlike some competitions, CCDC has several invitationals throughout the year to try to build up the skill sets by the students before they compete at regionals. Whereas some competitions just host once a year and then they wait for 2019, 2020 to happen. So what we decided to do is, hey, if you want to compete or if you'd like to volunteer, we'd like you to build our invitational out for us. So we invited a bunch of people out. Obviously, if you can show up in person, great. Online, even better. And people that were interested in volunteering got to build out our invitationals. So they kicked out a bunch of ideas, they built out a couple of wikis, and our volunteers, or the people that were kind of trying out more or less for either black team, white team, some of our other teams, built out these really fantastic, fun invitationals last year. And a lot of them actually stuck around, and that was one of the ways we were able to build out a user base, which is kind of unique to CCDC. Because as Wasabi was talking about earlier, retaining summer volunteers is kind of difficult, but if we build an environment for them to kind of see what CCDC is going to be like, how much time they're going to be able to put into it, what resources it's going to require from them, it has a better retention rate for some of our people returning for year over year, at least in my experience the last couple of years. So resources, how do we do this, right? At first, we pitched around containers because why not? Containers, they're awesome. It's really easy to automate. There's a lot of ways we can do it, a lot of different tool sets at our disposal. We ended up not containerizing a lot of things, I hate that word, this last year, mostly because we found that it created a very interesting barrier of entry because we were having a lot of people come in from volunteering, and not everyone necessarily knew how to Linux, not everyone necessarily knew how to write playbooks, how to Ansiblize, how to use Chef, Puppet. We didn't have a lot of those shared skill sets amongst a lot of our volunteers, so we thought, okay, maybe containers aren't a great idea. Maybe we can just go ahead and have people build out actual VMs. And some of our guys did end up using containers for a lot of things, but moving forward from that, we had a very interesting setup as well, because moving into the competition, when we started deploying a lot of things locally, we thought, okay, well, we're going to have a hybrid setup. How are we going to connect a lot of our cloud resources back down to our local setup? Because during regionals, we have everyone show up. This year, for the first time, we had people, instead of being at Cal Poly, we've moved everyone down to Coastline. So a lot of our resources that were normally available to us weren't actually available to us. So we thought, okay, so what do? Right? We can't necessarily bring everything that we've had in the cloud down this year in a very as quickly as we have needed to have done. So we decided just to link everything up with VPNs and have some of our resources in the cloud, and then do what we could to get some money to have some of our, like for example, our hypervisors hosted locally, so that we can kind of split our environment up so we can have a larger competition for that way. And then, of course, we kept our OVH servers. And then, how do we build? Do we do on-site hybrid cloud? We decided not to go with AWS, Azure Cloud, like I spoke about before. We decided to do a little bit of a hybrid with VPNs, actually, which was a lot of fun. And this year we had a really terrible idea with VPNs, actually. So we had a company that was in the cloud for each team, and then we had two companies that were local. And we decided, hey, so, companies, they need to be able to access resources from one server to another. Like, let's say if there's a merger, right? I need to be able to access my files on company B, even though I'm in company A. We decided, let's just link everything up with VPNs. So we had this really insane VPN mesh with a VPN from company A to company B, B to C, B back to A, and then A also to C, and it was just terrible. Like, it didn't work out great at all. We actually had a inject the second day where we had stayed up all night before. Well, actually, not even me. This credit does not go to me at all. But they thought, hey, what if we just bring everything down from OVH, and then not everything down, but a company, and we just give the blue teams instructions on how to do it themselves and make it an inject. So we did that, and actually worked out really well. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges that we faced this last year. And one of them, again, was our OVH challenge. Like, how do we host these resources and make them reliable to students in a way that was, financially viable for us, being a competition that really didn't have a really strong financial future, at least to us at the time. Oh, yeah. And OVH is actually doing really well. So those aren't familiar with OVH, it's a dedicated hosting server. They also do some cloud stuff. They're primarily located up in Canada, but they have some servers all over the world. But during one of our, I think it was the qualifiers, right? So during our qualifiers, we have, I think, 28 teams, 24 teams, something around there, competing, and then one of the hypervisors just went down. And it panicked and went down, and we lost probably like half of the team's pods. And then it rebooted. It took about 30 minutes for OVH to get back to us and say, oh, we don't know why, your server just panicked. It's coming back up right now. Like, oh, okay, cool. We paused the competition. Everything looks like it's coming up again. 10 minutes later, it goes down again. So it's like, all right, well, we're just going to take what we have and then score the points. And, hopefully we don't have to actually redo our qualifier, because that was not a good thing. So at the end of it, getting everything working, our motto, fuck it, good enough, right? Sometimes our best challenges are ones that are very, very broken. And one thing that we learned especially with CCDC having a very large competition, because we found out this year, we had a debrief recently, and we actually have a lot more VMs, machines, and services than Nationals does, right? So that's one thing maybe we can learn from, because this last year we had something close to 40 machines. We ended up bringing it down a little bit, but we had 40 machines, lots of services. Nationals doesn't do that. They seem to have less machines, maybe a little bit more quality on the services, and maybe they grade their SLAs a little bit more rough. That's something we can definitely, learn from. But one thing we need to do better in the future is we need to load test, because we have these massive systems, lots of services, lots of VMs, lots of tooling infrastructure, but we don't really load test enough to find problems that are going to happen before they actually happen to blue teams, like they did during our qualifiers. So, sometimes, that's Pikachu. Sometimes we just have to kind of run with it. We just don't have the time or resources to plan out everything in advance, and we just kind of hit the ground running, and sometimes, blue team just has to take the hit for us while we figure it out along the go. So, future work. We're very excited for this coming year. We want to incorporate all the things. We had a couple of really cool ideas that didn't quite pan out last year, but hopefully going to happen this year. We stayed up many nights working on some really cool stuff that blue teams didn't get to see. But hopefully for anyone volunteering or coming out to CCDC this year, or at least checking it out on Twitter, you'll get to see some really cool stuff. So one of those things, for example, that we like to do is start incorporating ICS systems. We see that a lot at Nationals, and it's more than likely if you're in the field, you'll see an ICS or two. So it's one of those things that we like to provide the experience to the students, and moreover, it's fun. Sometimes we can, go down the rabbit hole and get stuck in our terminals for so long that, we forget that things actually exist in real life. There's physical things in front of us all the time, physical infrastructure for us to tinker and play with. So that's one of the things we like to do for blue teams is give them a thing, give them a box. Like a couple years ago, I know Swiss and Wasabi had built this really cool factory that would blow up, and a lot of students hated it, and then also a lot of students loved it. So kind of running with that idea, building out even more terrible, fun, physical things for them to play with during a competition, I think will definitely generate a lot of interest. And then, of course, SEAM. Everyone always suggests it. It's very, obviously, it's everywhere, but never really implemented. And part of the problem that we've had with SEAM in the past is time. The competition only has X amount of hours over a couple of days, and students are already inundated enough as it is with a lot of the other services and systems that they have to administrate, secure, and moreover talk to Orange Team about, do their injects, that managing something like this maybe not in the cards, but it's something that I think that we'd like to look at in the future because it's actually something blue teams request quite frequently. And lastly, continuing our automation. We actually have a lot of tools we didn't showcase here just because they're all over the place, but we have quite a few tools. I know that Swiss from Black Team had a lot of really neat tools doing just amazing stuff with automating services with Ansible, automating a lot of the building of our VMs. We started using Discord, maybe even Slack in the future, but for now we just start using Discord for collaborating with a lot of the teams. And we have some bots that do some pretty cool stuff with managing our users, managing our help desk ticket with REST. We have a lot of really cool stuff we like to put out there this year for people to help maybe take a look at or start working on. And moreover than that, we'd like to start doing things. For example, Wasabi had a really good idea the other day about deploying vulnerable services and with either containers or maybe something along those lines. That way we can try to standardize how should I put it? So historically, when Black Team builds out an image, they say, oh, okay, I'm going to have, these X services, they're vulnerable, right? We write it down, and that's what we use to judge against and how Red Team gets in. But if we have a way to kind of standardize that we say, oh, we deployed playbook X, playbook Y, so we know that these web services are on this box. We know that this vulnerable services on this box and this rat's on this box. It's really easy from a judging standpoint to say, okay, this is one on here. This is what points they could lose or what points they can gain by securing it. And then further than that, we'd like to try to automate some of our layers of abstraction because Windows is awful. And we don't really have a standard with Black Team. So when we get these VMs, we get these images, they're kind of all over the place. Like a big one between us is always NAT. Do we NAT? Do we not NAT? It's awful. And there's pros and cons for both, but if we can try to start building out some of these tools to try to abstract what we do, maybe it might be easier to kind of get volunteers to come in here and build this stuff out. And then lastly, our conclusion. So, you want to take it?
All right, so that's the show, almost. So one thing I want to make sure that I let everyone know about is that we are looking for volunteers. We are looking for input for everything that's going on. The reason we came here today and spoke was because we want everyone in the audience to understand that we aren't trying to just build something like we always have. We are trying to get input. We're trying to make this event better, more fun for everyone, and we want people to get involved and enjoy getting involved. So with that, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, or you want to join up and help volunteer, let us know. So with that, I have some questions. They're mostly terrible. Yeah. Is there any real questions? There is one real question. So the question is, do you recommend instituting an internal CTF competition as a form of security awareness for training or non-security IT members, or would you just stick to a standard training program? And the answer is, it depends on what you're going for. Training is great, it'll teach you something new, but if you build out a competition that allows people to learn things that they may not know, and then train off of the things that they struggled on, it's sort of like what SANS does, where they have training and then they have the competition. It works very well because they can test their knowledge after they've learned what new thing they're supposed to be learning. So that's the way that I would go. What we've been doing is reverse, because we want teams to know in advance what they have to be aware of. And so we train the teams, we give them challenges, and then they won't see it again until the actual competition takes place. So if they prepared, if they joined in on all our trainings, they will have an understanding of what it is they need to do. Otherwise, they won't. So I think that way of having training and then going to get the competition and test their skills is the best possible way to do that. It's more fun for people and it's more rewarding. Is there any other questions? One question is, how do I make a small CTF for high school or other types of schools in general? Is CTFD will it makes the work a lot easier. You can host it in, CTFD actually has a hosting program they'll do, and you can just pay $5, I think it is, and they'll host it. And then the questions, There's a lot of online resources on Git and other places where you can find old challenge questions from different CTFs for various levels. You don't specifically have to do the challenges yourself, although it is fun and very good learning experience. You can find them if you're trying to make a small competition. And of course, you can ask questions if you want to help build a CTF. I have a lot of old challenges for different high school and college competitions I helped put together. So if you need those resources, just let me know and I'm happy to share them. And then the final question is, what are we doing to make it easier for volunteers to learn to be black team members? And I think I'd like to expand it from being just black team. What we are doing to try to build awareness about the competition in general and the different teams is giving people an idea, like we're doing here, about how the event goes on, what we do actually in the event. And then as we're building it up, we have started a mentoring program within the volunteers so that they can learn the skills that they need to. If they're not familiar with containers, for example, we teach them how to use containers and then let them start developing challenges on their own so they can continue to develop the skills. And the goal of that is so when someone goes in, this isn't just a give event. They will also get back new skills as volunteers. And so we're trying to make it open and insightful. We have documentation for volunteers. We have wikis and things on how we built things, why we chose what we chose. And all those resources put together really are helpful helpful for people starting out, especially with volunteering. And so does anyone have any other questions? All right. What? Oh, yeah.
And I do see a lot of familiar faces in here too. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out. And if you feel like volunteering at all, whether it's doing talks on red team stuff, doing black team stuff, it's not necessarily something that you need to invest a lot of time into. Like Joe was talking about, we actually are starting to put out kind of more or less, not necessarily a video series, but on Zoom where we invite students out to listen to us and we do some slides, talk about SIEM, talk about infrastructure, talk about sysadmin, talk about pen testing. So if anyone here is interested in that, you can follow us on Twitter, send us a DM, or just talk to us after the talk. If you're interested in just giving a one-off or just, sharing some knowledge, because, like I said, I see a lot of familiar faces here, and I know you guys have a few stories or two, and these students love that. So with that being said.
Yeah. That's pretty much it. Thank you guys for coming out, and I hope this has been informative on how a competition gets put together. So thank you guys.